The Tower of Joy is one of the most intriguing mysteries that the world of Ice and Fire provides us. It is speculated that the Tower of Joy is the location of the birth of Jon Snow by Lyanna, if, like most of us do in the fandom, one assumes that R plus L equals J is true. Even if R plus L equals J is not true, however, or that the Tower of Joy is simply unrelated, the Tower of Joy has such an air of mystery around it even still, due to the fact that there are many inconsistencies and lack of logic that goes into the story. Today we are going to discuss those many inconsistencies, talk about what I think the theory that makes the most sense would be, and why this entire thing is so important to the entire story at hand. The Tower of Joy is described very few times in the story. In Eddard 10, A Game of Thrones, under the influence of the milk of the poppy, we see the story, at least in part, inside Ned's dream. The scene is set after the Battle of the Trident, where Rhaegar was killed, after the sacking of King's Landing, where Aerys was killed, and after the break of the Siege of Storm's End. Ned, accompanied by Hallan Reed, William Dustin, Ethan Glover, Martin Cassell, Theo Wool, and Mark Risewell, all travel to Northern Dorne to the Tower of Joy. There they are confronted by the Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, Sir Arthur Dayne, and Sir Oswald Went, all knights of the Kingsguard. A battle takes place, and in the end, only Ned and Hallan were left standing. The scene ends with a very famous promise that Ned makes. Ned later describes bringing down the Tower of Joy and using its rubble to build memorials for all 8 of the fallen. Further, we know that Ned brought the sword Dawn back to Starfall, to Ashara more than likely, and when he finally returns home, he had a newborn Jon and the dead body of Lyanna with him. And so, in a nutshell, that's the entire story. But as you can kind of tell, there are a lot of inconsistencies with that telling. And so now let's try to unravel these inconsistencies one by one and try to make a theory as what probably happened. So let's start all the way back at the beginning. In the dream, Ned mentions to the 3 Kingsguard that he had expected to see them at the Battle of the Trident guarding Rhaegar. Then he expected to see them at the sacking of King's Landing guarding the King Aerys. Then he even kind of expected them to be at the Siege of Storm's End trying to take Robert's home. And finally he mentions he even expected them to be guarding the Prince Viserys and the pregnant Rhaella. But he found them here, in the middle of Northern Dorne, protecting a random tower. The Kingsguard even acknowledged the fact that if they had been at any of those events, the rebellion could have been swayed in the favor of the Targaryens, and honestly, they're probably right. They took down 5 of Ned's companions in 3-on-7 combat, and probably could have protected Rhaegar, certainly could have stopped Jaime from killing Aerys, and probably could have better have protected Viserys and Dany. So, again, why were they all the way out here? Of course, if you believe the theory that Lyanna was giving birth to Rhaegar's child, he could have ordered them to protect her. But that's not really in their job description. At the time that they would have been ordered away, Rhaegar was very much alive, and so was Aerys, and so was Viserys, and so was Rhaegar's other children. It would have gone against their oath to try to protect an unborn child when there were so many other people trying to protect, or so many other people to protect rather. It would have gone against their oath to stay back and protect one unborn child when there were so many royal members of the family left to protect. So let's circle back to that question. Further, on the topic of the Kingsguard, why in the world would they fight with Ned and the crew in the first place? Let's assume that the knights were protecting the new heir, and by extension Lyanna. Did Gerald Hightower, or any of the knights in his charge really, expect these Northmen, especially Lyanna's brother, to kill or even harass her in the slightest? They seem to at least respect each other, to at least have a conversation beforehand. Couldn't have either side at least have tried to negotiate a peace? Well, like I said, we'll circle back. Next mystery. Why did Ned even go to the Tower of Joy in the first place? What did he know that caused him to travel there? Now, we know that after the sacking of King's Landing, Ned and Robert got into a fight over Gregor Clegane killing the young children of Rhaegar and Elia Martell. After the fight, Ned went to break up the Siege of Storm's End, and that's all very understandable, and it makes sense. He was still serving his new king without actually having to be around him. What doesn't make sense is why he went to Dorne after that. I mean, if he knew that Lyanna was being held there, why would he take the time to go lift a siege? It would only make sense that he learned of Lyanna being held there at the siege, or at the very least on his way back from the siege, But from who would he even learn this information? On a side note, I would say that Ned would have had to have found out about Lyanna being held in Dorne when he was away from King's Landing, because Robert would have definitely insisted on going with Ned to go after her. Unfortunately, however, that just makes the mystery that much more murkier because the only people that could have known about Lyanna being in Dorne would have been in the capital. You could almost assume that Elia could have known, maybe Aerys, because Aerys sent a letter down south, but even still, these people would not have been with Ned when he could have theoretically found out about it. Now, the real final mystery is why Ned decided to take down the Tower of Joy. In reality, I think this mystery is the easiest to explain away. For one, he would have wanted to cover his tracks on Jon being a Targaryen, and destroying his birthplace is pretty much common sense. For two, irregardless of anything else in the story, his sister had just died, along with a lot of his friends, and the pain probably would have made him want to get rid of their dying place. But if you choose to believe either or both of those theories, I can't really blame you, and they both make sense to me. And so those are really the big prevailing mysteries with the Tower of Joy. So let's try to solve them little by little. First, let's try to build a little bit of a timeline. We know that Rhaegar quote unquote kidnapped Lyanna in the year 281 AC, so let's start there. We can speculate that Rhaegar took Lyanna to the Tower of Joy right after this, due to the fact that when Rickard and Brandon were executed, he is not noted at being present. Further, we can also speculate that Lyanna would have gotten pregnant in the months immediately after her abduction. We can infer this as Rhaegar reappeared after being called back to the capital from the south by Aerys, after the king realized that the war was more than a simple uprising after the battles of Summerhall, Ashford, and the Bells. Further, evidence supporting her pregnancy in this time is that Rhaegar did not bring back Wynt, Dane, or Hightower with him, and they were present at her abduction. Pausing here, we can begin to speculate on why the Kingsguard decided to stay back and protect the pregnant Lyanna. For one, we know at the very least Arthur Dane and Rhaegar were very close friends, or at least as close as Rhaegar allowed them to be. Perhaps it was simply a friend's request that kept them all there. We know that Hightower had told Jaime that his duty was to protect the king, not judge him, but perhaps Hightower had, like Jaime, began to realize that Rhaegar was the liege he should put his trust behind. Perhaps also, being so far out of the way of everything, it is possible that Hightower assumed that the combined power of Barristan Selmy, Jonathan Darry, Lewin Martell, and Jaime Lannister, the remaining Kingsguard back at the capital, could have protected the king and the heirs. I know that's a lot of speculation, but here's my ultimate theory for this. For one, I don't think that the Kingsguard at the tower, Lyanna, or Rhaegar knew about the rebellion, at least initially. I don't think Lyanna would have sat back and just let the injustice of her brother and father being executed, and her other two brothers going into open rebellion, without trying to do something. That's not Lyanna. We know Lyanna was way more wild-spirited than that. No, I think that Rhaegar was so obsessed with him getting his third head of the dragon that he was more concerned with keeping them safe than his father or the kingdom. So after the letter from the king was delivered detailing the rebellion, Rhaegar kept it a secret from his pregnant lover and his guard. But I hear the problem with this, and that is in Eddard 10, the Kingsguard seem to know a lot about the rebellion. They go on to explain about Jaime killing Aerys, Rhaegar falling out the trident. But if you notice, no, they don't. They don't really offer any knowledge of their own, but simply reply to what Ned tells them. I think this answers the question onto why they fought in the first place. From Ned's point of view, these men had kidnapped his sister. But from the Kingsguard's point of view, this usurper's friend came down to brag about all the death that occurred under their protection. The fight happened because of an accidental good by Ned. So I think that that's one mystery, I think. Next, how did Ned find out about Lyanna being at the Tower of Joy in the first place? Well, as mentioned earlier, he would have had to have found out when Robert was not in the immediate area. Meaning he would have had to have found out between the end of the sacking of King's Landing and the end of the siege of Storm's End. Honestly, this question has no real answer, and I think George is deliberately keeping it that way. But I think I have a theory that could at least make some sense, even if there is very little textual evidence for it. Tell me down in the comments below, has anyone ever heard of the character Richard Lonmouth? Probably not. He's a very obscure character. You see, Richard Longmouth was a squire for Rhaegar. His notable remarks in the series is that at the tourney of Harrenhal, he promised that to King Aerys that he would find out who the Knight of the Laughing Tree was. In the World of Ice and Fire, Lyanna's abduction was described as having been done by half a dozen people. We know that three of these people were the Kingsguard, and Rhaegar was obviously there. So that leaves a few more slots open for who these half dozen people could have been. So what if it was a squire, Richard Longmouth? But okay, even if he was there, how does that connect back to Ned finding out about Lyanna's whereabouts? Well, it just so happens that Richard Longmouth is a Stormlander. Specifically, he was actually really good friends with Robert. So here's the idea. Richard was present with Rhaegar during the abduction. Perhaps Rhaegar even told him about Lyanna being the Knight of the Laughing Tree, or hell, maybe even she told him. This would also make sense as to why George would include this detail. It kind of doesn't make sense for a random character to question this. And on their way down south to Dorne, Rhaegar dismisses Richard. I mean, he doesn't need a squire around while he's, abducting slash making love slash protecting his love, you know what I mean? And so Richard simply returns home to the Stormlands. When Ned shows up and breaks the siege at Storm's End, a now loyal to Robert and perhaps maybe just an opportunist, Richard tells Ned that Lyanna was being taken down to the Tower of Joy last he heard. Boom, that gives Ned the knowledge to go south. I think that makes a lot of sense to me personally. And so finally, the party arrives at the tower, the battle takes place, and Jon is born, Lyanna is dead, the tower is destroyed, the realm is in chaos, etc., etc. It sucks. Now, before I give the final summary of the theory, I do want to point out that it is noted that Ned returns the sword Dawn to Starfall, and people really try to question this action. The main reason for the questioning is that, for one, why would he honor an enemy? And even if you are going to honor an enemy, why not bring his body back with him also, so that the family had something to bury? The reason to honor not just Arthur, but all the Kingsguard, is that they gave their life protecting both his sister and his nephew. True, they die protecting her from himself, but I just kind of think that adds to the tragedy of Ned Stark. Also, they sacrificed their entire kingdom for his family, and I think that would have warmed Ned to them at least a little bit in the aftermath. The reason as to why not bring the body back is because in the Tower of Joy scene in Eddard 10, the Kingsguard say, the Kingsguard do not flee. I think that the Honorable Ned would have memorialized these warriors in their last battle as a symbol of them not fleeing. Also, in all honesty, I think that Ned needed comfort. His sister was dead. His friends and him were his friend Robert and him were fighting. He had a major secret to keep now, and 5 of his closest friends were dead also. So he went to Starfall to be with Ashara, as well as to get a wet nurse for Jon, who he desperately needed one. And he brought back Dawn as a pretense to get that comfort. I don't think that Ned and Ashara did anything sexual. I think he went to her literally just for comfort, and she provided it. But I don't think Ned would have let it go past that due to his marriage to Catelyn. So let's summarize his entire theory into one nice, digestible paragraph. Lyanna is quote-unquote abducted by Rhaegar with Wint, Dane, Hightower, Richard Longmouth, and perhaps a few other people. On the way to the Tower of Joy, Rhaegar dismisses Longmouth. Rhaegar does not tell his party about the rebellion and leaves a pregnant Lyanna to be guarded by his Kingsguard. Rhaegar dies at the Battle of the Trident. During the break of the siege of Storm's End, Ned is told by Longmouth that Lyanna was down south. Ned immediately rides south to the tower. Ned accidentally goads the Kingsguard into a fight, leaving only himself and Howland alive, and then Lyanna dies in childbirth. The tower is taken down, Ned goes to Starfell, and then eventually he goes home with his new quote-unquote son. And there you have it, my overall theory on the Tower of Joy. It's not perfect, and I'm probably wrong, but let me know what you think about it down below. I do think that Longmouth is dead now due to the fact that he is only mentioned in the past tense, meaning that this story can only really be told by Howland Reed. And a lot of people question why the Tower of Joy is such an important story to be told in this book, and that's because it really does explain how Jon was conceived, born, and how it makes him truly the heir to the Seven Kingdoms. A lot of people think that in the end it really won't matter if John is the heir, but I think that legitimizing John in this way will open the story up to so many different avenues, and I just think that after I don't know what 22 years more than that of this series being in serialization, we just really want this to be answered. But I guess we'll find out come the Winds of Winter when it gets released next week. See ya. That's all I got. Bye.